They say a man's soul can be cleansed with water. But in ancient Persia, we were taught the opposite. Purity was won in blood. I still remember the sight, nobles kneeling before a bronze basin, dipping their hands into warm crimson, the steam rising like incense. The blood was fresh, taken from the throat of a ram only moments before. Its iron scent clung to the air, metallic and sweet, and when the men lifted their hands, it dripped between their fingers like melted rubies. Some said it bound them to the king. Others whispered it was the gods who demanded it. I only knew one thing: once you washed your hands in blood, there was no turning back. The first time I saw it, I thought they were drowning their sins. It was not water they bent over, not the clear stream that runs cool from the mountains, but a bronze basin filled to the brim with blood. It was thick, steaming in the morning air, and the smell of it hit me before I saw the red. Iron and heat, copper and smoke, the air seemed to bite the inside of my nose as I breathed. The men pressed their hands into it, slowly, solemnly, as if lowering themselves into a sacred fire. Their fingers spread, their palms submerged, the blood lapping gently against skin. When they lifted their hands, it fell away in drops, each one heavy and glistening, tracing lines down their wrists. The light of the torches made it gleam like jewels, and yet there was nothing precious about it. I was too young to understand. I thought it was some strange kind of cleansing, that the filth of men could be washed away with what animals had given. But I learned quickly, this was not cleansing. It was binding. The bronze bowl itself was old, older than my father, older than the king whose shadow ruled our land. Its rim was carved with winged bulls, their eyes blank, their hooves stamping. The handles were fashioned like the heads of lions, jaws open, teeth catching the firelight. I later heard it was brought from the west, from Babylon, a relic of conquest that had been made sacred in our own way. Whatever its origin, it seemed alive to me. When the blood rippled inside it, I swore I could hear a heartbeat. That morning, they said the blood came from a ram. I had not seen the killing, only the aftermath. A priest had slit its throat in the temple yard, and they had carried the basin inside with such care that it seemed not an object but a god itself. The ram's life was gone, and yet in that bowl it seemed to linger. The men went forward one by one. Nobles, commanders, men whose names were heavy with power. They dipped their hands, murmured their vows, and stepped back. Each man's face was solemn, but in some I thought I saw fear. The blood marked them all. My father was among them. He was not the highest of lords, but he was bound by the same ritual. He pressed his hands in, lifted them, red dripping down his knuckles. He did not look at me as he turned away. His eyes were on the king's representative, standing at the far end of the chamber, watching every motion. Later, I asked him why they did it. He told me it was purification, that the blood of the ram carried away deceit and bound men to truth. But his voice was strained, and he wiped his hands on his robe long after they were dry. That was when I began to doubt, because what I saw did not look like cleansing. It looked like staining. The truth is that blood never leaves you. Wash it with water, and the water turns pink. Rub it with sand, and the skin grows raw. The smell lingers, stubborn and metallic, clinging to hair, to fabric, to breathe. That day, though my father had dipped his hands for only moments, I smelled it on him for hours. When he touched my shoulder, I recoiled. His hand was warm, and in my mind I saw it still dripping. I learned later that the ceremony was old. Herodotus would one day write of Persians who sealed their oaths in blood, though by then the form may have changed. To us, in that chamber, it was a law older than memory. Promises were not spoken alone, they were sealed in flesh and liquid life. To break an oath was not to lie, it was to betray the blood itself. Some whispered that Mithra demanded it, the god of covenant, the unseen witness of men's words. Others said it was Ahura Mazda, the highest of the wise lord, who required that men be bound not only by tongue but by the very essence of life. Still others said it was simply the king, cloaked in divine pretense, who wanted loyalty marked in a way no man could wash away. And perhaps all were true. I did not know it then, but I would come to see this ritual repeated many times. Each time the basin was filled, each time the blood was fresh. Sometimes it was ram, sometimes bull. Once, on the eve of war, I was told it had been a horse, a beast as noble as the men who swore above it. Always the basin was there, heavy, waiting, hungry. And always, when the men pressed their hands in, they seemed changed. They entered with open faces, cautious eyes. They withdrew with something darker written in their features. Blood did not cleanse. It marked. Even now, I can recall the heat of the torches on my skin, the murmur of the priests chanting verses I could not yet understand, the steady drip of blood onto the stone floor where men's hands shook. Each sound fused into memory. When I close my eyes, I can hear it still. The wet sound of hands meeting blood, the faint hiss as a torch spat resin, the whisper of cloth as men rubbed their palms against their robes, desperate to be clean and failing. Years later, when I myself was made to step forward, I thought of that day, but I will tell that part in its time. For now, I will tell you only this: the bowl was never empty. Not truly. You could clean it, polish it until the bronze shone like the sun, but in the cracks of the carvings, in the grooves of the lion's teeth, there was always something left. A shadow, a film, a darkness that no cloth could remove. It taught me a lesson before I ever touched it. Some stains are not meant to be erased. They are meant to be carried, but the blood never washed away, it clung. And soon it would cling to me. For the day came when my father pushed my hand toward the basin, and I had no choice but to touch. I was 8 years old, and already the blood reached for me. The chamber was crowded that day. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, their robes dark, their eyes watchful. The torches smoked against the walls, staining the plaster with streaks of black. I stood near the back, small enough that I had to tilt my head upward to see the basin on its stone stand. Yet I felt its presence even when my view was blocked. The blood had a way of finding you. I remember the trembling. Not mine, though I trembled too, but the men's. Great men, names whispered with reverence in the market, men who commanded soldiers and owned vast lands. I thought they were untouchable. But as they approached the basin, each one shook, ever so slightly, like reeds before a wind. Their lips moved in vows, but their eyes darted to the priest, to the guards, to the king's representative watching from his raised seat. That was the first time I learned power does not remove fear, it multiplies it. Children were not meant to take part in the ritual, not yet, but we were made to watch. Always we were brought in, sons of nobles, heirs of warriors, the next generation of hands that would one day be dipped. We stood behind our fathers, breathing the same air, smelling the same blood. It was said that if a child watched, he would never forget and never doubt the bond between man, king, and God. It worked. I never forgot. The basin was filled that day with the blood of a bull. I remember because the priest's robe was marked with flecks of foam, white against the red. They had slaughtered it at dawn, a great beast with horns curved like the moon. Its strength was meant to pass into the men who touched its blood, or so the priest said. But as I watched the blood steam, I thought the bull's strength was gone and only death remained. When my father's turn came, he walked forward with a firmness that fooled no one. His steps were measured, his back straight, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He pressed his palms down into the basin, the blood rising around his fingers, and for a moment he froze there, as if listening. Then he lifted his hands, dripping, and swore the words they all swore. His voice did not shake, but when he returned to me, his breath was shallow, and then it happened. He turned, and with a hand still red and wet, he pushed me forward. At first I thought it was a mistake, a stumble. But no, he placed me before the basin. The priest glanced at me, his eyes narrowing, then looked back at my father. No words were spoken. No protest was raised. Perhaps this too was part of the ritual, that sons should be touched by it early, Or perhaps my father, fearing his own wavering, thought to bind me more tightly than himself. The basin seemed taller than me. I had to stand on my toes to see into it. The blood was thicker up close, its surface broken by dark bubbles, its color deep and heavy. My stomach turned. The smell was everywhere, sharp, metallic, suffocating. I did not want to touch it. I wanted to turn, to run, to hide my hands behind my back and never let them near that basin. But my father's grip was firm on my shoulder. He pressed down, guiding me. His other hand, still wet, wrapped around my wrist and pulled it forward. When my fingers broke the surface, the warmth shocked me. I had expected coldness, like water in the river, but it was warm, almost hot, as if alive. It closed around my skin, thick and clinging. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was drowning. Not my whole body, but my hand, sinking into something that would not let go. The blood pulled at me, heavy, sticky. I tried to pull back, but my father pushed down. I do not remember if I cried out. I remember only the silence that filled me, the way the sounds of the chamber, chanting, footsteps, the scrape of sandals on stone, all faded until there was only the sound of my own heart. And beneath it, something else, a pulse that was not mine. When my father finally released me, I yanked my hand back. It came out red, dripping, the drops sliding between my small fingers and splattering on the floor. The blood ran down my wrist, soaking the cuff of my tunic. I stared at it in horror, my breath ragged, my hand trembling as if it no longer belonged to me. The priest said nothing. The other men said nothing. Only the king's representative shifted in his seat, his eyes resting on me longer than I wished. I felt exposed, marked, as if I had been claimed. My father whispered in my ear, "Now you are bound." Bound to what, I did not yet know, to the king, to the gods, to the blood itself. All I knew was that something had entered me, or perhaps stained me, and that it would not leave. That night I could not sleep. I rubbed my hand with cloth, with sand, even with ashes from the fire, but the smell lingered. When I pressed my fingers to my nose, the iron taste rose in my throat, making me gag. My mother found me in the corner, scrubbing my skin raw. She said nothing, only took my hand and held it in hers, but even she flinched at the warmth. Because that was the strangest part, my hand stayed warm. Long after the blood had dried, long after I had washed it, it held a heat that was not natural. It felt as though the bull's life still pulsed in me, though I wanted no part of it. I would later learn that I was not alone. Other children whispered of the same, the warmth, the smell, the dreams that followed. One boy told me he dreamed of horns growing from his head. Another said he heard the sound of hooves when he closed his eyes. We laughed nervously, but beneath the laughter was fear, because we understood, even as children, that we had been marked. It was not a game. It was not a story. It was a chain placed on us, link by link, while we were still small enough that it could never be broken. And though the years have buried many memories, I can tell you this with certainty: my hand was warm for days, though the blood was gone. But before a hand could be dipped, a throat had to be cut. And that was where the true heart of the ritual lay, in the killing itself. The ram's eyes were calm, as if it knew. It stood in the temple yard, tethered to a post carved with fire symbols, its wool thick and white beneath the morning sun. The rope around its neck was tight enough to hold, but loose enough that it could have fought. Yet it did not. Its stillness was almost human, the way its gaze moved over us, unblinking, unafraid. Some said the gods gave animals this silence before death, a final grace so their passing could serve a purpose. The priests moved with care. Their robes brushed the earth, their lips whispering prayers older than the empire itself. I caught fragments of words, Mithra, who watched oaths. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, shadows of names that meant little to me then, though they held the weight of heaven and earth to those who chanted them. Around us, nobles gathered, their sandals grinding against the gravel, their eyes fixed on the post. Some looked eager, others grim. For all their differences, they shared the same expectation that blood would be spilled, and through it, the bonds of men and gods would be sealed again. The ram shifted once, stamping a hoof. The sound echoed louder than it should have, cracking through the silence. My breath caught in my throat. I was close enough to see the pulse in its neck, the rise and fall of its sides as it breathed. A living rhythm, fragile and steady. Then the knife was brought out. It was not like the blades we used at home, dull from chopping roots or cutting reeds. This was a ritual knife, its edge polished until it gleamed, its handle wrapped in gold thread. The priest held it in both hands, lifting it toward the sky. The sun flashed across the metal, and for a moment it looked as though the knife itself were aflame. He spoke words I did not understand, though I recognized their cadence, the rise, the pause, the sharp downward drop at the end. Then he lowered the blade. The ram did not struggle. That is what stays with me. No wild thrashing, no desperate cries, only stillness as the knife pressed against its throat. The priest's hand was steady, his motion swift. The sound was not what I expected. Not the clash of metal, not the tearing of cloth, but a wet rip, quiet and final. The blood came in a rush. It poured from the gash, hot and dark, splattering onto the stone trough below. Steam rose as it struck the cold surface. The smell hit us at once, sharp, metallic, suffocating. It clung to the air, thick and sweet, filling mouths and lungs until we could taste it without drinking. The priests caught the flow in the bronze basin, tilting it so nothing was lost. Their hands were stained red to the wrists, but they did not flinch. They moved as if in a dance, practiced and precise, murmuring prayers as the life of the ram gushed away. And still the animal stood. Its legs buckled slowly, but even as it sank, its eyes stayed calm. There was no scream, no wail, only the steady release of blood until the wool at its chest was soaked crimson and the ground beneath it glistened. That was the moment I understood death could be silent, and silence could be more terrifying than cries. The nobles shifted uncomfortably. Some watched intently, their faces hard. Others looked away as though shame burned them, but no one spoke. The king's representative stood motionless, hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the basin. The basin filled quickly. The priest stirred it with carved sticks to keep it from clotting, murmuring that it must remain fluid, alive, or the gods would turn their faces. I remember watching the steam curl upward, twisting like spirits freed from flesh. In the wavering light, I thought I saw shapes in the smoke, horns, wings, faces that vanished when I blinked. The sound of chanting grew louder. The rhythm of it pulsed with the rhythm of the blood falling, as though one were answering the other. Each syllable seemed to press against my chest, and I felt dizzy. My hand sought my tunic, clutching it tight, but I could not look away. The smell was unbearable. My nose burned, my stomach clenched. I wanted to cover my face to run, but the thought of moving felt impossible. My father's hand rested on my shoulder, heavy as stone. He said nothing, but his grip told me all. You will watch. When the ram finally collapsed fully, its body slumped against the post, I felt a strange emptiness. Something had left with the blood. The priests cut the rope, letting the carcass fall to the ground, but no one rushed to move it. The life had been taken, the flesh was an afterthought. The basin, though, that was what mattered. They lifted it carefully, 2 men on either side, and carried it into the chamber. It seemed heavier than any bronze should be, though I knew it was not the metal but what it held. The blood sloshed gently, staining their robes, dripping onto the stones as they walked. Each drop left a mark, small and circular, like coins pressed into the earth. I followed with my eyes until the basin disappeared through the doorway. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. My throat ached dry and raw as though I had been the one cut. Later that night, I asked my father why the ram had not fought. He told me it was because animals know when they serve the gods, that their silence is obedience, that their blood is their offering, but I was not so sure. In its calm eyes, I had seen something else. Not obedience, but inevitability. The ram had not chosen. It had been chosen, Its silence was not devotion but resignation, and that terrified me more than anything. Because I began to wonder, when the day came for me to bleed, would I stand as still? Would my silence also serve as someone's ritual? That question haunted me. I tried to banish it by remembering the priest's words, the sacred names, the promise that the gods were honored and men were bound stronger. But the image of the knife, the sound of that rip, the smell of the blood, they stayed, and in them was no holiness, only loss. When its blood filled the bowl, so did our silence. They told us it was purification. They told us blood was truth. But as I watched men dip their hands into that steaming basin, I began to wonder if the truth was not something darker. We called it purity, though it stained everything. That was the lie spoken in the chamber, the whisper that floated above the steaming basin. The priests said the blood cleansed deceit, that by submerging our hands we washed away the shadows of falsehood, leaving only truth gleaming and bare. Yet every time I watched, the opposite seemed true. Men entered clean and left dripping, their robes streaked, their skin sticky. The stains did not vanish, they multiplied, and still no one questioned it. Why blood? Why not water, cool and clear, flowing from the mountains? Why not fire, eternal and bright, as Zoroaster himself had taught? The priests would answer, because water can be spilled and fire can be quenched, but blood is life, and life cannot be taken back once given. That was the heart of it. Blood was a covenant that could not be undone. Herodotus would one day write of us Persians that when men swore oaths, they mingled blood. He was not wrong. I saw it often, warriors cutting their arms, letting drops fall together onto the earth, their promises sealed not with words but with wounds. What he did not write, or perhaps did not know, was that in the king's courts, this custom was raised to spectacle. It was not enough for two men to share blood, the entire order of Persia had to be marked by it. The basin became the stage and all of us its unwilling actors. My father told me once, in a rare moment of candor, that blood was chosen because it frightened men. Water cools, fire dazzles, but blood unsettles. The smell alone turns the stomach, the sight makes the heart race. And so, by demanding we touch it, the king ensured no vow was ever taken lightly. To break an oath after placing your hands in blood was not merely treachery against the throne, it was betrayal of the life that had been sacrificed. It was clever. Terrifying, but clever. I confess, even as a boy, I felt it. When my hand was pressed into that basin, I swore nothing aloud, yet still I felt bound. My silence was a vow, though I never spoke it. The warmth of the blood seemed to coil around my wrist, tethering me to something greater or darker than myself. And here lies the strangest part. We were told it purified us, and in a way it did. Not by cleansing, but by marking. Once you had touched it, you were set apart. No matter what lies you might tell afterward, no matter what doubts you carried, the memory of that basin lingered. It made liars hesitate. It made traitors falter. It made loyal men loyal still. Purity, then, was not freedom from stain. It was the permanence of it. I remember one ceremony in particular, when the king's general returned from conquest in the east. He had broken tribes, burned cities, and carried prisoners back in chains. Yet before he could present his triumph to the court, he too was made to dip his hands. His victories were nothing without the mark of blood. He pressed his palms into the basin, lifted them high for all to see, and swore to the king that his sword would never falter. The blood dripped onto his armor, spattering the metal like red stars. The crowd cheered. I, watching from the shadows, felt only unease. Because I knew that, beneath the glory, the man was as bound as any servant. Even the mighty could not escape. Especially the mighty. In time, I began to see the ritual for what it truly was, not devotion to gods, but devotion to power. The priests cloaked it in words of purity and truth, but the basin did not serve heaven. It served the throne. The king needed loyalty that went beyond speech, beyond thought. He needed men to carry the memory of warm blood on their hands, to feel it long after they washed. He needed their fear more than their faith. And it worked. No oath sworn in water would have held such weight. No vow shouted before fire would have burned so deeply. Only blood, with its stink of mortality, its stubborn stains, its reminder that life itself was the currency of loyalty, could do what the king required. Sometimes I wonder if the gods were mocked by it, if Ahura Mazda looked down and saw not purity but parody. After all, Zoroaster taught of truth and lies, of the eternal battle between light and darkness. Was dipping our hands into gore truly a path to righteousness? Or was it the cleverest deceit of all to name fear as virtue and stain as purity? I cannot answer, I only know what I felt. Each time my father returned from such ceremonies, his hands smelled of iron. He would touch me, ruffle my hair, and I would recoil from the scent. It clung to him like smoke. Once, when I was older, I asked if he ever believed the ritual made him pure. He laughed, not with mirth, but with something bitter. Purity, he said. No, but it makes liars tremble. That was enough for him, but not for me, because I had seen his robe, stained at the cuff. I had seen him rub his palms raw against cloth, trying to rid himself of the smell. I had seen his eyes in the torchlight, dark with unease. He spoke of fear binding men to truth, but I suspected fear bound him as well. The priests insisted that when men touched the blood, their words became sacred, that even kings could not undo what was sworn. But I began to notice something else. The king himself never touched it. He stood apart, watching, his word already law. The rest of us, nobles, generals, servants, we dipped our hands, we swore, we carried the stain. He needed no stain, his word was already iron, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. We were told the blood purified us, but what it truly did was remind us that we were lesser. The king's command was clean, untouched, untainted. Our loyalty was dirty, bought with sacrifice and fear. The basin reminded us of our place. I tell you this because I can still remember the sensation. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake in the night with my palms tingling as though blood still clings to them. I smell iron when no iron is near. I taste it on my tongue, metallic and bitter, when I have spoken nothing but silence. This is the price of oaths made in blood. They are never finished. They linger long after the basin is empty, long after the priests are gone, long after the king himself is dust. The stain endures. And so, when I say we called it purity, I mean this. We told ourselves the blood made us better so that we could bear the truth that it had made us less. Less free, less clean, less human. Even the king's word smelled of iron. And when we lifted our blood-wet hands toward him, we told ourselves it was to honor the divine. But I knew the truth. We were saluting a man, and his shadow was darker than any god's. They raised their blood-wet hands as if saluting the sun. The basin stood in the center of the chamber, steaming, the air thick with the smell of iron. One by one, the nobles pressed their palms into it, lifted them, and turned toward the raised seat at the far end of the hall. The motion was the same every time, a slow lift, arms extended upward, fingers spread wide so the blood could be seen dripping between them. In the flicker of torchlight, the droplets looked like sparks falling, red fire in the air. From a distance, it might have seemed like worship, a congregation, their hands lifted toward heaven. And that is what the priests would say, that the men lifted their hands to honor Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, or to call on Mithra, keeper of oaths, to witness their loyalty. But I was close enough to see where their eyes turned. Not to the sky, not to the unseen heavens, but to the man seated in shadow, the king's representative, draped in robes of gold thread, his face unreadable. It was not the gods we saluted, it was the throne. The chamber was designed for this spectacle. The torches were placed so that the far end lay half in darkness, the raised seat glowing faintly as if haloed. The man who sat there seemed more than human, less than flesh. Every dripping hand was lifted toward him, every vow directed into his silence. The blood was not offered upward, it was offered forward. I remember the sound. The chanting of priests behind us, the shuffle of sandals as men took their turn, the slow hiss of blood sliding from fingertips onto stone. It formed a rhythm hypnotic, almost musical. My own breath fell into it, shallow and unsteady. It was as though the chamber itself demanded I keep time with the ritual. At first I felt awe. The kind of awe a child feels when standing in the presence of something vast, incomprehensible. The sight of so many great men bending themselves to the same act, men who commanded armies, men who owned villages, all leveling their hands toward one figure. It seemed unity, order, strength, but awe curdled into dread. Because I realized something then, all of them were afraid. I could see it in their eyes, in the tremor of their lips as they swore. Their faces were solemn masks, but fear leaked through the cracks. Not fear of the gods, gods are distant, merciful in their slowness. No, this was fear of the man in shadow. Fear of his silence, his gaze, his power to undo them. It struck me like a blow. The ritual was not about cleansing or purity or even the gods. It was about display, about showing the king and each other that they were willing to stain themselves, willing to bow, willing to let blood mark them. I watched my father lift his own hands, dripping red, his shoulders squared, his voice steady as he swore. And yet, beneath the steadiness, I saw the tightness in his jaw. He looked not at heaven, but at the throne. It was then I felt the first true shadow of the king. Not the man himself, who was far away in Persepolis, but his presence, stretched thin and heavy across every hall, every oath, every basin of blood. He was not here, but he was everywhere. We called it loyalty, but it felt like chains. I remember vividly a man who faltered. His name is lost to me now, but his image remains. He dipped his hands, lifted them, and for a moment his arms wavered. The blood dripped too quickly, splattering onto the floor. His vow stuttered on his lips. The priests leaned forward, the guards shifted. A silence fell sharper than any knife. He recovered, finished the words, and stepped back. No punishment came that day. But afterward, in whispers, I heard that his estate was seized months later, his family scattered. No one dared to link it to his hesitation, but we all thought it. The basin left no room for weakness. That was the lesson. Blood made loyalty visible, and hesitation was a crime the throne never forgave. Even as a child, I knew to mask my feelings. When my father nudged me to lift my small, blood-marked hand, I did so. My arm trembled, but I forced it upward. I looked toward the shadowed seat, though my heart longed to look away. The weight of 100 eyes pressed against me. My hand seemed to burn in the air, heavy with heat that was not mine. I whispered nothing, for children were not asked to swear, but silence itself became a vow. The blood dripping from my fingers said enough. Later, when I lay awake in my chamber, I realized something strange. I remembered the torches, the basin, the priests. But what I remembered most was the man in shadow. He had not spoken a word. He had not moved more than a breath, and yet all of us had lifted our hands to him. It was not his power that bound us, it was our fear of what his silence meant. There is a kind of authority more terrifying than commands, the authority that does not need to speak. When a man sits unmoving, when his silence is heavier than iron, it forces others to imagine what he might do. And imagination is crueler than reality. The king, or his shadow, did not need to act. He needed only to watch, and men would stain themselves willingly. That was the genius of the ritual. It pretended to be for the gods, but it was crafted for men, not for the common people who never saw these chambers. For us, nobles, warriors, servants of the court, it reminded us that the king's silence was louder than any prayer. I confess, part of me admired it. To command without speaking, to make men bleed with nothing but presence, is that not the highest form of power? Yet admiration twisted with dread. Because I saw where it left us. We were not cleansed, we were not united in faith. We were animals led to dip our hands into blood, lifting them in a grotesque parody of worship, saluting not the sun but the throne. And every time the same thought came to me, unbidden and unstoppable, one day I too will raise my hands. One day I too will salute, and what if my voice falters? What if my hand shakes too much? Will I vanish like the man whose name I cannot recall? It haunted me. Even now, as I speak these words, I can still feel the heat of torches on my skin, the stickiness of blood drying between my fingers, the shadowed gaze pressing down like a weight. I can still hear the silence that followed every oath, heavy and expectant, as if waiting to devour the next man. We told ourselves we were saluting the divine, but deep down we knew better. We were saluting a man, but we were saluting the man who could kill us, and if blood was offered before fire, it was because fire too was watching. In the temples, the flames leapt higher whenever blood was spilled, as though the gods themselves were witnesses to our fear. The flames leapt higher whenever the blood was spilled. It may have been only the draught, a gust from the temple's open door, or the shift of air as men passed. But when I stood there as a boy, I swore the fire itself shuddered at the sight of blood. The torches along the walls seemed to crack louder, their smoke twisting into frantic shapes. And the great fire at the center, the sacred flame the priests tended day and night, flared as if it were alive, reaching upward to lick the ceiling. They said this was proof the gods were watching, that Ahura Mazda, Lord of Light and Truth, bore witness through flame. That Mithra, guardian of covenants, leaned down unseen whenever hands dripped crimson before fire. I wanted to believe it, but I could not. Because fire was purity and blood was not. Zoroaster's words, repeated endlessly by the priests, taught us that water and fire were sacred. They were not to be polluted. Fire must not be fed with corpses or waste or anything unclean. It was the bridge between mortal and divine, the purest symbol of order. Yet here, in the shadow of the basin, fire was made to dance alongside blood. Opposites bound together, purity and filth, light and gore. I remember staring at the flame until my eyes watered, trying to see if it recoiled. Did it shrink when the basin entered? Did it darken? But no, it leapt higher as if delighted by the offering. The priests chanted louder then, their voices rising with the fire. Truth is bound, lies are burned, the covenant is sealed. But in my heart I felt a reversal. The flame was not cleansing the blood. The blood was staining the flame. The fire temple itself was a place of order. The floor was swept clean each morning, not a speck of dirt allowed near the sacred hearth. The walls were polished smooth, pale stone reflecting every flicker of light. The priests wore white robes when tending the flame, their hands washed, their mouths covered with cloth so their breath could not defile it. Yet on the days of the blood ritual, all of that purity was broken. The clean floor grew spotted with red, the white robes darkened at the cuffs. The sacred cloths hung damp from the steam rising out of the basin. The air smelled not of incense, but of iron. It was as though two faiths, two worlds, collided in that chamber. One ancient, born of fear and sacrifice. The other newer, born of order, purity, truth. And rather than replacing the old with the new, they had fused into something more powerful than either alone. That was the brilliance of the king's priests. They knew that men would not abandon old rites easily, so they took them and wove them into fire. And what had once been a sacrifice to shadowed gods became, in their words, a covenant under heaven's light. But no matter how they spoke it, I saw the contradiction. Fire did not purify the blood. The blood polluted the fire, and yet the people accepted it, perhaps because they needed both. Purity without blood was too abstract, blood without purity was too raw. But together they bound the body and the spirit, the hand and the soul. I recall one priest in particular, an old man with a voice like cracked stone. He told us children, the fire is the eye of the god, and the blood is the truth you cannot hide. Before the fire, nothing false survives. His words thrilled me then, filled me with a sense of being watched, weighed, measured. But years later, when I remembered the blood spattering onto the temple stones, I wondered, was it truth that bled or only fear? Because I saw fear everywhere. When the nobles lifted their blood-dripping hands toward the fire, their faces shone with sweat. Some whispered their oaths so softly the priests had to lean forward to catch the words. Others shouted too loudly, trying to drown out their own trembling, and the flame roared above them, swallowing each vow in its light. But fire was not merciful. Fire did not cleanse. Fire only consumed. The priests burned scraps of cloth soaked with blood in the smaller flames near the basin. The smell was acrid, choking, worse even than the raw iron stench. It filled our noses, stung our eyes. They said it carried the vows upward, smoke delivering words to the sky. But to me it felt like desecration, as though we were smearing the heavens with ash. One day after such a ceremony, I asked my father if he thought the fire was truly divine. He answered without hesitation, "Yes, fire sees, fire knows." But then he added quietly, "And fire destroys." That was the lesson he left unspoken. The fire was not there to bless us. It was there to remind us that all things, even oaths, can burn. And so, in the temple, fear deepened. The basin bound our hands in blood. The flame burned our vows in smoke. Together they left no escape. If you lied, the blood remembered. If you betrayed, the fire witnessed. There was no purity in it, only a trap. I saw this trap most clearly when a man hesitated at the basin. His hands hovered above the blood, trembling, his lips pressed thin. The priests urged him, softly at first, then louder. The fire behind them leapt higher, casting long shadows across his face. At last he plunged his hands in, splashing red onto the stones. When he lifted them, he turned not toward the gods, but toward the throne. His voice shook, but he swore the oath. Later, his hesitation was whispered about, judged, remembered. The fire had seen. The blood had marked. He was a dead man long before soldiers came to drag him away. It was then I realized the fire's true role, not witness, not blessing, but weapon. It magnified the fear already dripping from our hands. It gave the stain of blood an audience too vast to escape. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see those flames. Not as light, not as warmth, but as mouths, open, devouring, never sated. The priests fed them blood and smoke, but they always seemed hungry still. And I confess, part of me feared them more than the basin. The basin touched only the body. The fire seemed to touch the soul, but fire cleansed nothing, it only burned. And what of the man who refused? What of the one who would not let his hands sink into blood, nor lift them toward fire? His story is still whispered, and its ending is darker than the flames. I still see his hands, clean and trembling. It was unusual from the start. The chamber was thick with heat that evening, the fire roaring higher than usual, the basin steaming as though it boiled with life. The nobles stood in a line, waiting their turn, each one stepping forward to press their hands into the blood, to lift them toward the fire and the throne. The ritual was as familiar as breathing. None dared question it. None dared falter. And then came the man who refused. His name was whispered, though never too loudly, never too often. I will not speak it here, though it burns in my memory. He was not the highest noble, but he was not small either. A man of some land, some soldiers, some weight in the court. A man whose absence would be noticed, and so, whose refusal carried danger. When he reached the basin, he stopped, his lips pressed together, his shoulders stiff. His eyes flickered to the fire, to the shadowed figure at the far end, then back to the blood. His hands hovered above it, shaking. The priests urged him forward. "Purify yourself," they said. "Seal your truth, bind yourself in the sight of the fire." Their voices grew harder when he did not move. The guards shifted, their sandals scraping against stone. The chamber grew restless, breath catching in throats. Still he did not touch it. The blood steamed beneath him, rich and dark, but his hands stayed clean. And for a moment, a terrible silence fell. It was as though the entire hall held its breath, waiting for a thunderclap. Then he spoke. Quietly, but every word rang like iron on stone. "My truth needs no blood." It was madness or courage, perhaps both. Gasps rippled through the hall. A priest raised his hand as if to strike him. Another whispered frantically into the shadows, where the king's representative sat unmoving. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. I could feel the fear pouring off the men around me, thicker than incense. For an instant I hoped that nothing would happen, that his refusal would be ignored, overlooked, buried in silence. That the ritual would continue and the basin would forget him, but blood does not forget. And neither did the throne. The guards moved quickly. They seized him by the arms, forcing him down onto the stone floor. He did not fight, though his head snapped upward once, defiantly, as if daring the fire to look away. His hands, still clean, trembled in the air, fingers spread as though in a last gesture of freedom. The priests shouted curses. Unclean. Defiled, enemy of truth. Their voices echoed like thunder. The nobles turned their faces aside, some muttering prayers, others pale with dread. I wanted to look away, but I could not. One of the guards held his arms back while another drew a knife. Not the ritual blade, not the one wrapped in gold thread, meant for sacrifice, but a soldier's knife, practical, crude. With a single motion, he drove it through the man's palm. The scream tore through the chamber. Not the scream of a ram, silent and calm, but the raw, human cry of a man who had chosen wrong. Blood spilled, bright and shocking, spattering the stone. It flowed from him without ceremony, without sanctity. The basin was untouched, but the floor was marked. His oath, they said, was forced from him in the only way left, not in reverence but in punishment. They dragged him from the chamber, his cries fading down the corridors. The smell of his blood lingered long after he was gone. That night, whispers spread through the city. Some said he was executed at once, his body burned as a warning. Others claimed he was left alive but mutilated, his hands cut away so he could never again lift them in defiance. A few swore he was cast into darkness, locked in a pit where no fire could reach him. But what I remember most clearly is the fear that followed. The next morning, the priest spoke of him as though he had never existed. His name was not mentioned. His seat at the council was already empty, his land already promised to another. But in every glance, in every pause of silence, the memory of him remained. His clean hands haunted us more than his bloodied ones, because that was the lesson, not that the ritual bound us, not that the fire purified, but that refusal was impossible. To step back from the basin was to step out of life itself. I was young, but I understood. His defiance had not been met with debate nor with persuasion. It had been met with the knife. His truth, my truth needs no blood, had been answered with the tearing of flesh. His clean hands had lasted only a moment. By dawn, they were no longer his. I confess I dreamed of him often afterward. In my sleep, I saw his trembling fingers hovering above the basin, never touching. I saw the knife pierce his palm, saw the blood dripping onto the stones where mine had once dripped too. I woke with my own hands aching, clenching the sheets as though trying to hold them clean. And in those dreams, I felt both horror and envy. Horror at his fate, envy at his defiance. He had spoken words I never dared. He had looked at the blood and said no. For that, he was destroyed. But in that single instant, before the knife fell, he was freer than any of us. It frightened me more than the fire, more than the basin, more than the throne itself, the idea that defiance was possible. That one could refuse. That one could stand, if only for a moment, with clean hands. But the fear swallowed me again each time I remembered his screams. And so, like the others, I obeyed. I obeyed even when I no longer believed. I obeyed even when I guided others' hands into the basin, and with each touch the stain spread deeper until their fear became mine. I guided others' hands into the basin, though I wanted to pull them away. By then I was grown, no longer the boy who trembled behind his father. My own shoulders carried the weight of expectation, my own name listed among those who stood closest to the throne, and with that name came duty, not only to dip my hands, but to lead others into the blood. The basin had not changed, it never changed. The same bronze, the same lions with jaws parted in eternal hunger, the same winged bulls carved along its rim, but I had changed. I was no longer a child peering upward, nor a youth forced forward by a father's grip. I was a man, and worse, I was an example. The priests placed me beside the basin, a guide and a guard both. When men faltered, it was my hand that steadied theirs. When men hesitated, it was my voice that whispered, "Do it." And when men resisted, it was my strength that pressed their palms downward until the blood swallowed them. The first time I did it, I thought I would be sick. The noble before me was younger than most, his face pale, his lips trembling. His eyes darted from the basin to the fire, then to me. He whispered, "I do not want to." For an instant, I saw myself in him, the boy I had once been, whispering the same to my father in silence. I wanted to let him turn away, to shield him, to say, "Then don't." But behind me, the priests watched. The guards shifted. The fire hissed as though listening. And so I took his hand in mine and lowered it into the blood. It was hot that day, thicker than usual, the smell suffocating. The blood rose between his fingers, coating our joined hands. He gasped, tried to pull back, but I held him fast. When he lifted his hand at last, dripping, it was not only his that was stained. Mine was too, and that was the moment I understood I would never be clean again. For years afterward, the memory haunted me. Not of my own hand dipping, I had grown used to that, but of guiding another's. Of being the instrument, not merely the victim. I could still feel the tremor of his fingers in my grip, the desperate pull against me, the weight of his fear pressed into my palm. It clung to me more tightly than the blood itself. The stain was no longer on the skin alone. It seeped inward. Each time I guided another man's hand, I felt the corruption crawl deeper, as though the basin had found a way inside me. I told myself I had no choice. That to resist would mean ruin, as it had for the man whose clean hands were pierced with knives. I told myself I was protecting them, that if it were not me, it would be someone harsher, crueler, who would force them forward without a shred of mercy. Better my hand, I whispered, than another's. But the truth is harder. The truth is that I became the basin, I became the hand that stained, and once you learn to stain others, you cannot pretend to be clean. I remember a soldier once, scarred and weary from battle, who approached the basin with dead eyes. He did not hesitate, did not tremble. He pressed his hands in without waiting, lifted them, swore the words, and turned away. His fear was buried too deep to show. But the boy who followed him, no older than 15, shook like a leaf. He was pressed into service, the son of some lesser noble, his name demanded by the throne. His eyes begged me as he stood before the blood. I felt his plea in my bones, "Help me, save me." And still, I guided his hand down. I tell you this now because it still burns in me. His hand was small, trembling, hot with blood not his own. When I let go, he looked at me with something worse than hatred. He looked at me with betrayal, as if I had taken something from him he could never recover. And perhaps I had. That night I could not sleep. My dreams were full of hands, dozens, hundreds, all stained, all reaching for me. They clutched my arms, my neck, dragging me down into a basin deeper than the earth itself. I woke gasping, my skin clammy, and when I pressed my palms to my face, I swore I smelled iron again. The priests told us the ritual brought purity. But I felt only corruption. The more I guided others, the more I felt hollowed out. My voice became mechanical, my hands automatic. "Do it," I would whisper. "Press down. Lift." The words left my mouth without thought, as though they belonged to the basin itself, not to me. And men obeyed, not because of me, but because of the blood, the fire, the shadow behind us all. Still, I could not shake the truth. I was complicit. I was part of the machinery. I had become the very hand that had once pressed me down. Sometimes, when the chamber was empty, I stood before the basin alone. I stared at its rim, at the grooves darkened by years of blood that never fully washed away. I would dip my hand in, not because the ritual demanded it, but because I wanted to feel if it was mine still, or if it belonged only to the basin now. Every time it came back red. Every time I felt the same heat, the same clinging stain, And every time I asked myself, is this what my father felt? Did he too lie awake, smelling iron in his dreams? Did he too feel the betrayal of guiding his child into the blood? Or had he buried it deeper, learned to silence the guilt until it was nothing but a whisper? I never asked him. I never had the courage. But I know this, the stain on my skin was not just mine. It was passed from father to son, from hand to hand, until all of us were marked. And perhaps that was the ritual's true power, not the oaths, not the fire, not the fear, but the way it made us complicit in each other's corruption. Every trembling hand I guided left its mark on me, and every hand I pressed down carried mine with it. Their fear became mine, multiplied, and fear does not stay in the day. It follows you into the night, into your dreams, where basins grow endless and blood rises higher than breath. At night I dreamed the basin was endless. It stretched wider than any hall, deeper than any river, its bronze rim vanishing into darkness. I stood at its edge, looking down, and the blood did not shimmer with firelight as it did in the temple. No, it churned like a sea, waves rising and falling, thick and slow, the surface breaking with bubbles that popped like whispers. Sometimes I dreamed that the basin pulled at me as though it had tides. The red surface would rise toward me, and I would feel it tug at my feet, my hands, my breath. I tried to step back, but the floor beneath me tilted, always forward, always toward the abyss. I woke gasping, my body slick with sweat, my fingers clawing at the air as though still reaching for balance. I did not tell anyone, how could I? Men do not speak of such things, but alone in the dark I began to fear the nights more than the days. Insomnia crept into me slowly. First it was a hesitation, a reluctance to close my eyes, to let my mind sink where it pleased. Then it was a tightening in my chest as night fell, the dread of knowing sleep would not be rest, but trial. Soon I found myself sitting by the fire until dawn, my eyes dry, my body heavy, unwilling to surrender to the dream basin waiting for me. The priests would have said my dreams were omens. The Persians have always trusted dreams. Kings consulted them, soldiers recorded them, merchants spoke of them as warnings or blessings. A dream of blood, they said, was a dream of betrayal. A dream of fire meant truth was coming. A dream of drowning meant lies were about to be uncovered. If that were true, then my nights were nothing but betrayals and lies. Because in my dreams I did not only stand beside the basin, I sank into it. The blood rose around me, warm as breath, closing over my chest, my throat, my mouth. I struggled, kicked, clawed upward, but the surface thickened like tar, refusing me air. My screams became bubbles, my arms weakened. And just as I thought I would vanish into it forever, I saw them, the faces of all whose hands I had guided. They floated around me, pale and silent, their eyes open but unblinking. They did not accuse me with words, but with their stillness, their stares, their blood mixed with mine, indistinguishable. I woke with my heart hammering so violently I thought it would tear from my chest. There is a cruelty to dreams. Waking life can be endured, shaped, silenced, but dreams betray you. They drag from within what you hide in the day. By night I was not a noble, not a servant of the king, not a keeper of oaths. I was a man drowning in blood that would never wash away. And the worst part, some nights I stopped struggling. I would let the basin take me, sinking deeper, the warmth enclosing me like a womb. The voices of priests became muffled, distant. The fire above turned to a faint glow, and in that suffocating embrace I felt a strange peace. The peace of surrender, of no longer resisting the stain, of letting it consume me whole. I would wake ashamed, breathless, heart aching with guilt, because even in my dreams I could not escape complicity. I began to notice the blood outside of sleep, too. A basin in the temple, yes, but also in the world. A red tint in wine, the gleam of wet clay, the reflection of dawn on copper. Everywhere I looked, I saw blood, and with it the memory of hands trembling, forced, bound. Once, after a ceremony, I returned home and found my wife sleeping peacefully. I touched her shoulder and she stirred, smiling faintly, still lost in her dreams. For a moment, I envied her. Then I looked at my hand resting on her skin, and I imagined it dripping. I pulled it back, ashamed. I could not even touch what I loved without the basin between us. I tell you this now as confession. It was not only fear that followed me into the night. It was guilt, a guilt that stained deeper than the blood itself. And here lies the cruelest truth: guilt itself is a kind of ritual. It repeats, it stains, it binds. Long after the priests were silent and the torches burned out, I carried the ceremony within me. My body slept, but my soul kept watch over an endless basin. The Persians wrote dreams as omens, inscribed them into clay tablets, carried them to priests for interpretation. Had I done so, perhaps they would have said mine meant I would betray or be betrayed. Perhaps they would have said I carried lies within me and the gods were warning me. Perhaps they would have ordered another ceremony, another cleansing, another plunge into blood, but I never spoke of them. Because I knew the truth, no basin could cleanse me. The stain was not on my skin anymore, it was in me. So I remained silent, waking each morning with the same heaviness. My eyes stung from sleeplessness, my hands ached with invisible weight, my mouth dry as dust. And yet, when the summons came, I still went to the chamber. I still guided hands into blood. I still whispered the words they needed to hear. Because that is the final cruelty of guilt. It does not stop you. It only multiplies what you already do. And so, even when my eyes burned from lack of sleep, even when my dreams drowned me, even when my heart whispered rebellion, I obeyed. Because rebellion was death and guilt was survival. I thought I could live with that bargain. But each time I woke from the basin of dreams, choking, gasping, I tasted iron. It was not a trick of memory. It was real. My tongue carried it, my throat burned with it, as though the blood itself followed me from the dream into the waking. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth. And soon, whispers began to rise, not from dreams, but from the priests themselves. Whispers that true purity was not in blood at all, but in water. Yet whispers are fragile things and blood is louder. They began to whisper that true purity was water, not blood. It started quietly, behind closed doors, in corners of the temple where the firelight did not quite reach. A few priests, their robes worn, their voices weary, spoke words not meant for every ear. They quoted the Gathas, Zoroaster's oldest hymns, where truth and purity were bound not to blood, but to a Shah, order, righteousness, the clean flow of water, the eternal clarity of fire. Blood is not purity, I heard one murmur. It is death. The wise Lord does not dwell in death. Another nodded, eyes darting nervously toward the chamber door. Yes, purity is in what cleanses, water, fire, not what stains, not what clings. The first time I overheard such words, my stomach turned to stone. To question the basin was to question the throne. To doubt blood was to doubt loyalty itself. And yet they said it, priests whose lives were sworn to both God and king. It unsettled me more than any scream, any knife, because screams are fleeting, but whispers linger. I began to notice more signs, a priest's hesitation before dipping the ritual stick. The way another lingered longer than necessary when washing his own hands after the ceremony, scrubbing as though he could erase more than blood. Once I saw a slip of parchment tucked under an altar, written in a hurried hand, "Truth is not iron, truth flows." I do not know whose hand wrote it. I only know that when I returned the next day, it was gone. The idea gnawed at me. Could it be true? Could all those years of plunging hands into blood have been a deception, a corruption of what was once pure? The Gathas did speak of water as sacred, of fire as pure. Nowhere did they speak of washing in blood. Perhaps the priests who whispered were not heretics, but faithful in a way the rest of us had forgotten. But faith is fragile and fear is strong. When I dared to ask my father, by then older, wearier, his hands scarred from years of oaths, he silenced me with a glare. "Do not repeat such madness," he hissed. "Do you want the fate of the man who refused?" His voice cracked at the edges, though. He had heard the whispers too, and perhaps, somewhere deep, he feared they were true. At night, I found myself staring into bowls of water, watching how it rippled when touched. Clear, cool, cleansing. It felt so different from the basin, no clinging, no smell of iron. For the first time in years, I dipped my hands into water and did not imagine betrayal. For a moment, I almost believed I could be clean. But the next morning, the summons came, and I was back before the basin. Blood steaming, priests chanting, fire leaping. Whatever purity water offered, it was drowned in iron and ritual. The whispers spread, though always in secret. Some said Zoroaster himself would have condemned the basin, that his true teaching was being twisted by kings who valued fear over truth. Others claimed it was not the priests but the throne that clung to blood, that the king feared losing the stain because the stain was obedience. I wanted to believe them, but belief was dangerous. Once after a ceremony, I caught one of the younger priests looking at me strangely. His eyes lingered, searching, as though testing whether I too carried the whisper. My chest tightened. I looked away too quickly. The next day he was gone from the temple. No one spoke of where he had gone. That was when I understood whispers could kill as surely as knives, and yet they did not stop. That was the miracle, or perhaps the curse. No matter how many vanished, no matter how often names were erased, the words returned. Purity is water, truth is fire, blood is nothing but fear. Like weeds breaking through stone, they kept pushing upward, fragile but persistent. And each time I heard them, a part of me shifted, because deep within I had known it all along. Had I not felt the stain cling to me? Had I not dreamed of drowning in endless basins, choking on iron? Had I not woken each morning with the taste of metal on my tongue? That was not purity. That was corruption. And yet I had forced others into it, whispering obedience while silence screamed within me. The doubt grew unbearable. During ceremonies, I began to imagine what it would be like if the basin were filled with water instead of blood. I pictured hands emerging clean, dripping not red but clear. I imagined vows made without the smell of death, without the shadow of fear, but imagination is not enough. The basin was always blood. The fire was always watching. The throne was always silent, heavy, immovable. And so I remained complicit, even as whispers clawed at my heart. It is strange how whispers sound louder than chants once you have heard them. The priests shouted of purity in blood, the guards barked commands, the fire roared, but behind it all, in the back of my mind, the whispers remained. Truth flows, purity does not cling, the wise Lord does not dwell in death. I think now that this was the beginning of the end. Not the screams of the man who refused, not the punishments, not even the dreams. It was the whispers, because whispers are seeds, and once planted they grow, but blood has always been louder. And so, though whispers stirred, the basin remained. Men still dipped their hands, still raised them dripping, still swore with iron on their breath. The fire still flared, the priests still chanted, and I still guided trembling fingers into the stain. Yet deep inside I began to wonder what happens when whispers rise louder than blood. The basin would one day empty, the fire would fade, but the stain endured. And when the ritual collapsed, it left behind not purity, not truth, only the echo of blood. The basin is gone, but I still see my hands red. The bronze was melted down long ago, or so they say. Perhaps it was broken, perhaps hidden, perhaps left to rot in some forgotten corner of the empire. The priests who once chanted beside it are dust, their hymns scattered on the wind. The fire that once leapt when blood was spilled is only ashes in ruins where weeds grow through cracked stone. But none of that matters, because the basin never left, it lives in me. I see it in dreams, yes, the endless sea of red, the hands reaching upward, but I see it too in waking life. In the way water catches the morning sun and turns briefly crimson. In the way a cut on my finger sends a drop sliding down, glistening, heavier than it should be. In the way silence gathers whenever men make promises, as though we are all waiting for someone to bring out the basin again. I thought time would wash it away, that the years, the wars, the rise and fall of kings would bury the memory. But the stain clings. Not to skin, not to robes, those can be scrubbed, burned, discarded. No, it clings to the soul. They told us it was purity, but it was not purity, it was fear. Fear that bound us tighter than any oath. Fear that silenced us more completely than any knife. Fear that made us complicit in our own staining. The basin taught us that truth was not free, but bought with life. That loyalty was not spoken, but enforced. That obedience was not choice, but necessity. And once you learn such lessons, you do not forget. Even now, when I raise my hands to drink, to eat, to greet, I imagine them dripping. I see the red lines running down my wrists. I hear the soft patter of drops striking stone. My mouth tastes of iron when no iron is near. I wonder sometimes if my body itself has changed, if my blood flows thicker, heavier, because of all that I touched. Others, too, carry it. I see it in their eyes, men older than me, men younger, men who never even knew the basin yet inherited its shadow. They look at their own hands as though doubting them. They speak oaths with hesitation, remembering the price their fathers once paid. The ritual is gone, but its echo remains, stretched across generations like a curse. And perhaps that was always its purpose. Not the purification of one day, not the loyalty of one reign, but the creation of a memory that would not fade. Fear that outlives the fire, stains that survive the skin. When I was young, I thought the basin was eternal, that it would stand forever, filled again and again. I feared it would never end. I was wrong. The basin ended, but its echo did not. The echo is louder than the ritual itself. Because now it exists not in bronze and blood, but in silence. In the way men lower their eyes when truth is spoken. In the way we swallow words that might be dangerous. In the way we obey without understanding why. The basin taught us obedience, and obedience lingers longer than monuments. I sometimes wonder if this is true of all rituals, not only ours, not only Persia's, but all the world's, that the symbols may fade, the ceremonies crumble, but the fear they plant grows roots too deep to tear out. The priests said blood was life, that dipping our hands in it bound us to truth. But what I learned is darker. Blood is memory. And memory is the one oath that never breaks. When I close my eyes, I see that man still, the one who refused, his hands clean and trembling. I see the knife descend, the scream, the red spilling anyway. He tried to stay unstained, but by dawn the basin had claimed him too. He was proof of the lesson, no one escapes. You either dip your hands willingly, or they will be dipped for you. That is the cruelty of fear. It takes even the brave. And so the ritual lingers, though no priest chants, though no basin steams. It lingers because fear is passed like inheritance, father to son, teacher to pupil, hand to hand. I know this because I passed it myself. I pressed trembling hands into blood. I whispered obedience when my soul screamed against it. I carried the stain forward, multiplied it. That is my confession. I sometimes dream of another ending. Of lifting my hands clean, water dripping instead of blood, truth spoken without iron on the breath. A world where purity was not fear, but freedom. But I know such a world never was, and perhaps never will be. And so I return to the memory over and over because it will not leave me. The basin is gone. The fire is ash. The priests are dust. The throne itself is scattered in ruins. But when I look at my hands, they are still red. And perhaps that is what they wanted, for us to carry the stain forever.